Hey, welcome back, everyone. So we're back here in my apartment again, and let's get started for the night. So I have the chat up. I can actually see what you're all saying now. You might notice I have a better camera finally. Also got a mic finally, so hopefully quality's a bit better this time around. I appreciate your all support. Now, so first off, we had a couple questions from last week left over. I'll get to. First one was from Hesky 10600. It says, will the U.S. federal government ban all the CCP-owned apps, including Weibo, and how much exactly do the CCP have the influence with President Alexander Lukashenko, President Lukashenko? Okay, so when it comes to this, the U.S. possibly banning other Chinese tech companies, actually they could, and in fact, there's been some speculation on that and some public reporting on it, and I'll explain this. When it comes to why they banned WeChat and why they banned TikTok, when it comes to the U.S. government, the allegations that it's being used for spying, the allegations that it's a security threat, those same allegations can be used for just about every single Chinese tech company. The same basic reasoning they used to ban TikTok and ban WeChat could be used for just about any Chinese tech company. And so if they can legally do this and they can do it without much pushback, they can replicate that exact same model for just about every single one of them. And there have been cases against just about every single one of them. If you look at things like, say, malware found in the firmware of devices, including phones, you've seen it in just about every Chinese tech product, at least a lot of the ones you find sold in like Amazon and stuff. When it comes to privacy issues, it's not just companies themselves, but even companies, for example, that might go and buy data, like from Facebook, which there are companies that do that. You find some big, of course, a lot of the social media platforms, they make their money by selling your data, right? They're free for you, but they make their money by selling your data. If you look at who the clients of that are, some of them do sell it to Chinese companies. And so you have to think, what is all the, not even just social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter. You have to think all the apps you have on your phone and what kind of data are they collecting? And are those Chinese apps, and who do they sell that data to? I mean, the intertwining webs of this stuff is so deep when you get into it that, it could be big. If the United States actually wanted to go against these companies, they can go after a ton of them. I mean, and you look at, another question we have is about Tencent on here. A couple of people ask about Tencent. Yeah, you look at Tencent, another big Chinese tech company. They have their hands in just about everything. I mean, Epic Games, some of the big video game platforms, they're involved in. There's this big thing going on right now about, what is it, Player Unknown Battlegrounds and Apple and banning it from the App Store, and people are freaking out. Tencent and these different companies, they go and they buy these popular games and they get them on their platforms. And so really, we'll have to see where it goes. Can they do it? They definitely could. Will they do it? We'll have to see. Now, we did see one thing important on this, or two things important on this that came out recently. One was this, it was a video discussion. There was a U.S. official came out and told one of the individuals on it, I think we reported on it, to anticipate once every 2 to 3 days until the time of the 2020 elections, until the November elections, that every 3 to 4 days or 2 to 3 days, can't remember which, we're gonna be seeing a different case against a different Chinese company. And there was also a State Department official announcement alert to U.S. universities and colleges, telling them to start divesting from Chinese companies, because by the end of next year, they anticipate a lot of these companies getting kicked out of the stock market. And how is that going to happen? Well, it's probably not going to be executive order type stuff like we're seeing now. So I'm just checking the comments here. It's probably not going to be executive order stuff like we're seeing now, where TikTok and WeChat just got banned off the bat. What they're going to be doing with a lot of these publicly listed Chinese companies on the U.S. stock market is they're going to be going through them, and they're going to be looking at, they're going to be doing audits, essentially. Because here's what's happening now. These companies are immune to audits. They're not being held to the same standards as U.S. companies or other foreign companies. If they're on the stock exchange and the Chinese companies, they're being protected by the Chinese Communist Party. And investors have no idea what they're really investing in. These are black boxes, a lot of these companies. The U.S. is saying they can no longer do that. And so they're anticipating that once they start looking into these companies, they're going to start finding a lot of different issues, just like we saw with Luckin Coffee, just like we're seeing with some other big Chinese companies now, that basically they've been lying about their finances in order to get investments. Let's see here. Next question from Trump 2020. Hesky 10600 again. The U.S. government will literally go all out to ban Weibo and all other Tencent CCP apps and ban all of the Tencent stakes and all of the U.S. MNCs. Is the CCP involved in Belarus? So I won't go into WeChat and Tencent again because I just talked about that. The issue in Belarus is complicated. So in Belarus right now, you just asked about President Lukashenko there. Lukashenko's called, like, I think he's nicknamed the last dictator of Europe. That's debatable whether there are other dictators in Europe currently. It depends how you weigh it. But Lukashenko has very close ties to the CCP, and he recently won re-election, I think in his, I want to say, 7th term. People went on the streets and they're protesting now, like mass, large-scale protests against him and against his hold on the country. And the CCP is stepping in to support Lukashenko. Now, I think I mentioned, I don't want to restate analysis I've done before because I think I've talked about this on the main show. But this is really what we saw happen in Venezuela. Why is this similar? The CCP, its investments in Belarus are very similar to investments in Venezuela. Basically, the CCP is trying to make Belarus its gateway to Europe with its One Belt, One Road initiative, or the Silk Road initiative. It was trying to use its ties with Belarus to get into the European market. And so it was pouring money into Belarus. And it also had a lot of support for Lukashenko. Now that the CCP is risking losing that support, because if another leader comes in and pushes the CCP out, the CCP is about to lose all of that influence, basically, is what you're seeing happen. And that was the same thing that happened with Venezuela. The CCP was going in there with Maduro and it was supporting him and funding all these different projects in the country. When that happened, when Maduro started getting, I wouldn't say kicked out, but people were wanting to kick him out. The CCP and Russia came in to rescue him, basically, and told the U.S. that if they intervened, they would defend it. And why was that? It's because just like with Belarus, the CCP had been pouring money into it, into its infrastructure and all these things. And if it were to lose that, it would lose its gateway, one of the main gateways into Latin America, into that region, and also all of its former investments. Now, could the CCP defend Belarus and Lukashenko like it has in Venezuela with Maduro? Probably not, because this is Europe. This isn't Latin America. In other words, the CCP doesn't have as much control there. It doesn't have as much influence there. And even other European countries might do something about it were that to happen. And so, we'll see how things develop. If Belarus flips, if Lukashenko gets kicked out, or if he concedes in some way, and if the CCP does lose influence there, I mean, this is going to be a major blow to the CCP and its attempts to try to, again, make Belarus its gateway into Europe. This is a huge blow to the One Belt, One Road initiative. Next question, Kate Hitt. TikTok suing the Trump administration. Yeah, so TikTok is trying to sue the Trump administration, and there's also a group of lawyers. They have some name like the WeChat Chinese users group or something like that are also trying to sue the Trump administration and saying that he's, violating user rights by, banning these platforms. Will it work? Probably not, because really you can look at the actions of these companies, and if you want to audit them and get them to come on to, the U.S. books and prove for a fact they're not stealing data, we'll have to see, because the entire issue of the Chinese government's involvement in these companies is going to have to come out. And really, there's a lot of evidence on it. I don't see it going anywhere. At the most, the CCP might be hoping to, leverage this. If it's them doing this, we can't say for sure. But they could be leveraging this because it's going to make the U.S. look bad. They can go in the courts and they can make a big fuss about racism and discrimination, and you're just mad at, you just don't like China, and on and on and on. They're going to get kicked, they're going to get kicked out anyways. And so why not make an argument and do what you can in the short term to try to make sure the U.S. doesn't go after additional Chinese companies? If they make enough of a fuss about it, that'll work for them. Because here's what's going to happen. They're going to go into the courts, and all the media, because they're attacking Trump, all the media that want to back those same attacks are going to repeat everything they say verbatim. And so this is probably going to be something used for the 2020 elections, where it's going to be a big, optic show, basically a big facade, making a big show, and it'll give them talking points to attack Trump and say he's racist. That's how I see this playing out, at least. And so, yeah, they're trying to sue him. Whether they can actually do something about it, probably not. But again, they have nothing to lose at this point. What's going to happen? They're going to get kicked out. They're going to get kicked out of the country. Why not, take it to court and make a big fuss about it? Because again, if they can stall it there, if they can make Trump look bad, if they can make the U.S. look bad, for them, that is strategically valuable, and that those optics, the appearance of that, could prevent additional attacks on other Chinese companies, at least as far as I could see them in analyzing it. Next question up from Larry Sebens. How long till the USA calls the debt due, then seize the assets? And thanks in advance. So that's a big one. So everyone talks about how we talked about this before. Everyone talks about how China owns the United States, right? China, it owns America's debt. If they can sell our debt, if we cause problems with them, when we'll go and it'll destroy our economy. Everyone's heard these things. It's not true. It's more complicated than that. If the CCP were to sell American debt, other countries or other groups would come in and buy it because they want it. It wouldn't just hang on the market. People would buy it up pretty quick. And the other big part of it is that China owes about so the U.S. debt to China is about 1.1 trillion. The Chinese debt to the United States is about 1.8 trillion. And unlike the United States is paying the CCP like millions of dollars on a regular basis, the Chinese Communist Party has not paid us a single cent. And so not only should we really, every drop of money we've given them in order to pay interest on that debt never have been paid, they should have been paying us additional money on our debt that they were supposed to be paying to us. All the Trump administration needs to do is just say, we're going to hold you accountable for this. Our debt is null and void, and you still owe us about $7 billion. Sorry, 1.8, so $700 billion. They could do that tomorrow if they wanted to. The Trump administration could do that tomorrow. And there are different lawmakers now that are backing that, getting behind it. One sec. Hey, Don Finn, I appreciate the donation. Do you think the UN is corrupt? I do think the Chinese Communist Party has taken over most of the leadership positions in the UN, and the ones they haven't fully taken over, they have huge influence over. The United Nations is complicated. It was started by a lot of individuals who had ties with Russia, including the Soviet Union at the time, including one individual who was later arrested, I believe, for acting as an agent of the Soviet Union. So the United Nations always had its issues. I understand the vision of it was to make sure something like the Holocaust never happened again. Look, the Chinese Communist Party runs, or one of the main groups runs, the Human Rights Council right now. There have been cases, I've mentioned this before, so I won't go too deep into it. There have been cases of Chinese people trying to bring their cases to the United Nations, and the United Nations provided their names to the CCP, and they got arrested. One of them ended up dying in custody. And so really, I do think it's corrupt. I think it's incredibly corrupt. And I think the CCP basically uses it as a hand puppet, essentially. And really, I don't think there's any value in the U.S. being there, just my personal opinion, based on, of course, my reporting. Some people might disagree with me, of course, but because they believe there should be some engagement. They believe you should keep those gateways of engagement open. The problem is when the institutions themselves no longer serve the function they're meant to. When the institutions themselves have been subverted, well, is it really useful paying them money to continue acting against you? Because they're not interested in diplomacy. They're not interested in changing their ways, right? They're interested in using the international institutions that you've established against you. This is one of the things they talk about. It's a borrowed boat strategy. It's the saying they have: strangle you with your own systems. If you make these systems open and available to the world community, they will do everything they can to take them over. This is war for them. And so, the UN in that regard, I would say, is very corrupt, unfortunately. Not to say everyone there is corrupt, but there are groups that are not acting independently, put it that way. Paul Crane, thank you for the donation. Thank you for your expertise. I've learned a lot from you. I'm glad. Really appreciate it as well. Next question from In the Matrix. Would CCP use geoengineering against U.S. like Iowa? I'm not familiar with what you mean by geoengineering. I assume you mean ecological warfare or environmental warfare, where they're like stealing seeds or putting things into the soil that make it so you can't grow seeds. I mean, they do this. This is part of their warfare doctrine. So, for example, in the Unrestricted Warfare book, it talks about this, written by 2 Chinese colonels, one of whom went on to be one of the major leaders of the PLA, People's Liberation Army. Now, what is ecological warfare or environmental warfare, depending on how you translate it? It is the intentional destruction of the environment for warfare purposes. So, for example, the CCP damming off major rivers for Asia and denying countries downstream access to those rivers, that would be called ecological warfare or environmental warfare. The CCP going in and buying up resources and denying the access of those resources to other countries, that would be ecological warfare. The Chinese Communist Party trying to deny the sale of, let's say, rare earth minerals to Japan when they had a conflict over the Senkaku Islands several years back. That would be ecological warfare or resource warfare, depending on how you define it. When it comes to the use of seeds and things like this, one of the big reasons why people getting these seed packets from China was so controversial, and the USDA was investigating it, is they were saying, oh, it might be an invasive species. Keep in mind, the introduction of dogs, frogs, and different plant life to Australia really messed up the ecological system. You can do that to countries. You can introduce things to them that will damage their ecology. For the CCP, this is warfare. Also, you get into some bioengineered seeds. I mean, like big companies like Monsanto might sell, for example. They have them so they can't reproduce. You have to buy them from them every year. Some of these products, you use it on your soil, and you can only grow their products in your soil after that. There are big companies that do this kind of thing. I think it's extremely corrupt, but that's just big business, unfortunately. I don't think it should be allowed, if you ask me, but again, that's my opinion. But for the CCP, doing things like this would also be considered warfare. That would be ecological warfare within their doctrine. They would do things like this, and yeah, they would have interest in doing that. Paul Crane, I really appreciate the donation again. Do you see U.S. pulling out of UN? If you were to ask me 3 years ago, I'd say no. These days, I would say yes, because the U.S. has already pulled out of several branches of the UN, most recently the WHO. I think the U.S. would consider pulling out of the UN, and I think it's actually getting kind of likely they will. The Chinese Communist Party has subverted many of the leadership positions within the UN. And so again, if it cannot act independently, because one of the things officials, when they go into the UN, are supposed to do, they're supposed to put aside national interests, right? They're supposed to kind of become world citizens, if you want to use that phrase. When they go into it, they're not supposed to hold national interest when they go into it. And the CCP requires them to hold national interest. And if the CCP's people are in most of the leadership positions, then the UN is no longer an independent body. The United Nations, if the CCP is doing that, it is no longer an independent body, and it's no longer acting on international interests. It's acting for the CCP's interests. In other words, by subverting those positions and by forcing the individuals in them to act in the interest of the CCP, it just becomes a branch of the Chinese government. That's all it is. At that stage, if by, again, subverting an open system, getting people into it, and then telling those people they have to act in the interest of the CCP, they turn those branches of the United Nations into basically arms of the Chinese government. These are like provincial arms of the Chinese government. And the CCP is using these to basically form, its own world government force, essentially, where it can influence global politics. And yes, you could say United Nations doesn't, of course, govern countries and so on, but a lot of countries do adopt its policies. And when it puts out handbooks on policy and guidance for policy, a lot of countries adopt those. And so it does have a lot of influence. And so, yeah, I do see the U.S. pulling out of it. I really do at this point. All right, let's see here. Oh, wow. Maui's side. I really appreciate it. Thank you as well. And Donovan again, do you think this coming winter we'll have a food shortage? To be honest, I think we will. I don't want to answer this again because I talk about it a lot, and I think I have the same basic analysis every time. But the CCP, just summing it up, has multiple disasters from many different angles. During the virus time itself, it was already facing food shortages. On top of that, you have droughts in the north. You have floods in central and southern China. Before all of this, the black soil regions in China were already receding. They were already having food crisis in China, which is why they abandoned their programs for grain self-sufficiency and switched to pig farms and poultry and stuff. But then he had the swine flu, then he had the avian flu. And so, they were already getting decimated without having to face all the current disasters they're facing. And then on top of it, they have locusts coming in now. And remember, the United Nations was already warning about food shortages just from that. And so you have multiple crises coming simultaneously, each of which in and of itself would be a threat to their food supplies. And so, yeah, I do think China, at the very least, has a high risk of a food shortage based on that. And then Xi Jinping comes out and announces, this clean plates program, and tells people that, all this propaganda about clean plates and food security. And then the media in China starts saying there's no issue with food security, despite Xi himself coming out and using the phrase. And so, yeah, all the signs are there, everything's there. I really think it will be an issue. Next question from Frosty Flake. Do you think Trump will highlight CCP's preference for Biden in their propaganda mouthpiece? The Trump administration is already using that. And so, we'll have to see how this works out. It's complicated. People, of course, talk about Joe Biden's son having made business deals with other countries and so on. It's indirect. It's indirect ties to Biden with a lot of this. The Trump administration in their advertising is already pushing that. And so this is going to be a talking point. And we'll have to see how this affects things, honestly, because it's going to put the Democrats in an odd position where they're going to have to either disprove Trump or side with China. And I honestly hope that they do not side with the CCP during this time. And at the very least, I can say they haven't shown signs of it. And so, yeah, we'll have to see how this works. The Trump administration is calling out Biden for his ties to the CCP, mostly through his son. And that is becoming a talking point. And so we'll have to see. And also the Democrats, they haven't really gone strong. Well, they have. They've gone pretty strong against the CCP. When it comes to their current policy, they're not being that strong. And so the Trump administration can use this because China now is a mainstream, very big topic. And so this will be one of the main talking points. We'll just have to see how it plays out. Marlene R., do you think Rocket Man is pulling a ruse by saying he's in a coma? You're talking about Kim Jong-un. To be honest, I think he might have always been in a coma back from the first time we heard he was in a coma, and his sister suddenly became like the de facto leader of the North Korean regime, and he just kind of disappeared. I think the whole thing was weird. Now, keep in mind, if you're a personality cult that tries telling people that you're basically, the God Emperor, that's not to use that phrase, but they try to make him a religious icon. It's a personality cult. It's a communist regime that works as a personality cult. Their leaders are like their gods, and so if Kim Jong-un is sick and dying, that's a big deal for the country. And so when rumors came out that he had a brain injury or brain damage, or he was in a coma, and he disappeared from the public eye for a long time, and everyone thought he might be dead, what happened? Well, they said, oh, look, he's alive. But look, his sister now is in the de facto leading role of the Korean regime. He's still alive. He's not going to be saying anything anymore. But, look at your new de facto leader. And everyone said that, but everyone was like, okay, sure, yeah, new leader of North Korea. First thing she does is she blows up the liaison office between North Korea and South Korea, right? And starts taking a hardline stance. That's her putting on a show. That's her putting. It had no impact. That's her putting on a show, and basically trying to reestablish her image of strength. And now they're saying that he's in a coma. Honestly, I think it is the case. I think he might have always been in a coma, or he's back in one, and he's just been out of the public eye, or maybe he's dead. Who knows? Again, with North Korea, the ability to get information out is so tight that it's hard to tell anyways. But I do think the reports might be accurate on this. Next question from Greg Testiot. Joshua, who will lead the charge in defending fishing rights in Ecuador? I mean, we'll have to see. So I believe Ecuador is the country right now struggling with the CCP over the Galapagos Islands, if I'm not mistaken. Chinese fishing boats have gone into that region. They're, using very aggressive fishing methods that are destructive of the environment. It's kind of I'm trying to analyze what the CCP is thinking right now, because they're under attack from so many different directions ideologically. South China Sea, I mean, all of its mask diplomacy, the whole virus cover up, trade issues, businesses getting attacked, natural disasters, Japan, Australia, India, and the US making an alliance against it. India becoming more of a really strong ally with foreign countries and developing its military and making military ties with Japan, which means that China is now surrounded on two sides. And on top of it, you have Taiwan becoming really more so a really legitimized country on the international stage that represents China, but represents the good China. I mean, I could go on and on. The CCP is facing so many different crises simultaneously, and then it does stupid things like this that just, are when you're dealing with, conservatives and liberals, or conservatives and liberals tend, typically the conservatives care more about the business stuff, liberals care more about the humanitarian stuff. If the US is going against the CCP on the business side, they could leverage that. They could talk about business attacks and American greed and discrimination. But as soon as you start attacking the environment, then you have both sides attacking you. I mean, strategically, I don't know what they're thinking. Maybe they're just not thinking about it. Maybe they're just letting these things happen. Or maybe, as I've heard some analysts say, maybe they're doing it intentionally. I've mentioned before, one of the proposed strategies in China right now is just locking down the borders, basically starting the Cultural Revolution again, and using that system to reestablish the strength of the CCP, holding internal party purges, and all the systems are in place for that. In fact, they've already set up different departments to carry that out. Locking down the borders, telling the Chinese people all the other countries are against us, and so we have to keep things closed, and this is it now. Now they're establishing, again, different government branches to carry out internal party purges like that and announce they're going to start doing it. They've created an internal digital yuan. So they have a digital currency, so money can't flow outside of China, meaning it has to circulate internally. And the CCP is trying to reestablish these different controls. All the signs are there that may actually be the case. So in addition to liberal conservative politics, you also then have Latin America. And a lot of Latin America does lean towards the CCP, mainly, I think, because it has been a blind spot for the United States. This is one of the unfortunate realities you have in Latin America. Countries like Brazil want to align with the United States. They want to partner with the United States. A lot of these countries wish the U.S. would be more engaged there. The problem is a lot of them are having trouble financially. A lot of them have issues that they can't really deal with. Not to mention corruption, drug trade, and so on. Issues that are beyond their control if the politicians themselves aren't involved in it. And then you have the Chinese Communist Party coming in and offering boatloads of money and all these infrastructure deals and offering to help pull them out of that state, or bribing the officials. The United States needs to have something on par with that if it's going to compete with the CCP in Latin America. And currently it doesn't have anything like that. And of course, we don't want to be getting countries into debt traps and seizing their property like the CCP is. But having some kind of infrastructure projects, having some kind of investment project where you're helping these countries build themselves, this is what they're waiting for. This is what the Brazilian government is waiting for. And unfortunately, the U.S. is not doing it. And you have guys like Bolsonaro who want to align with the U.S., but they're basically saying there that if the U.S. doesn't come in and do that, then they're going to have to align with the CCP. Just in terms of how these things work, I think it's unfortunate. But again, the CCP now starting problems with different countries there. They're throwing a wrench in that whole system. And so it could have the opposite effect. I mean, again, it's this picture they're painting where I would like to imagine they have some deeper strategy to it, but they're being so reckless right now. And they're doing things that are so, I mean, not to be crude, but so stupid right now that it doesn't make strategic sense unless for some reason they're trying to turn countries against them. That's the only The only way you could reason it, which may be because, again, they're trying to lock down the borders and say we're surrounded by enemies. Will that save the CCP? Probably not even that. But again, the situation is bizarre. Next question. This is from Douglas Hull. Does the Polar Silk Road hide military ambitions? Right. So when you get into the Arctic and Antarctica, they call the Arctic the ultimate high ground. Well, they call space the ultimate high ground, but it's one of them. Mainly because when you're dealing with ballistic missiles and nuclear defense programs, the CCP can only get them so close to the United States. And having, say, missile bases in the Arctic would be strategically valuable to them, and it's something that they have been wanting to do for a long time. You go back to the Cold War; they were talking about things like this. The CCP wants to gain that, gain more territory where it can, and also do exploration for things like oil wherever it can. It does have military ambitions. It does also have resource ambitions, so it's a bit of both. And also it helps them position themselves closer to the United States militarily, which is one of their big interests. Let's see here, next questions. This is from L. Ray. How do you see USA-China relations if Biden takes the reins? It's complicated. I mean, we'll have to see. Now, here's the thing. If you were to ask me what will the U.S. position be on China, let's say, 5-6 years ago before Trump, I honestly didn't have a lot of hope. I didn't think much could be done against the CCP because it has subverted so many industries. It has involvement with so many major businesses. I mean, you look now at the companies just being called out for being involved in slave labor in Xinjiang with the Uyghur Muslims. I mean, you have pretty much the entire apparel industry, a lot of the automotive industry, and a lot of other companies just being involved in slavery, let alone being involved with Chinese companies or with other human rights abuses in China in general. And we're just talking about one region. The overlap, the infiltration of businesses, the CCP's ability to influence businesses, the media training programs they have that work with a lot of major media through Xinhua, the advertisements you had, and sorry, I have a map on my wall, so I sometimes look at it when I talk at home. The overlap, the intertwining relationships are so tight. Then you have the university subversion, Chinese spies, Chinese programs like 1,000 Talents program, 100 Talents program, Torch program, 973 program, 211 program. I mean, hard, aggressive programs to infiltrate our institutions on a huge scale. And just about every country in the world are doing this. For me, seeing that system dismantled, I did not think any government would ever do it. And for the simple reason is this: you would have to be really aggressive. You would have to make really aggressive moves in order to change that. And I did not see any politician being willing to be aggressive to that extent. Trump has done that, and he's still doing it. And to be honest, it's even caught me by surprise. I didn't think anybody would do it, especially if you're dealing with conservatives and liberals, Democrats, I guess you could say, or Republicans and Democrats, because Republicans, they tend to want free trade. Even a lot of the, you're talking about libertarians and stuff. Some of them don't believe government should intervene in free trade. And so there's a lot of complicated issues when you're dealing with it. If you're dealing with party politics, normally a Republican government wouldn't do things that harm American businesses. For example, like doing moves that would impact U.S. business interests in China. Trump has a different way of viewing it, at least from what I've seen. He thinks that if these companies pull out, they will be better off. It's just a matter of making them pull out. But of course, these companies are there for a reason. They've assessed pricing, costs, what's the cost of moving, what do we have to do in exchange to remain here. A lot of them may be interested in trying to keep their businesses in China, and they don't want to lose the Chinese market. And so they're staying there because they want to access the Chinese market. My point with saying this is normally Republican candidates would not go after that. Trump doesn't seem to have an issue going after that, which is interesting because this shows a change culturally within the entire Republican Party. People talk about Republicans in name only, the rhinos, or the more economic Republicans. A lot of them have actually moved to side with the Democrats, it does seem. And I mean, really, the entire cultural structure when it comes to U.S. politics has changed in the last 4 years. The Republican Party is no longer the same party, and the Democratic Party is no longer the same party. The Republican Party fractured. You had the rhinos, and you had the Trump train, whatever you want to call them. And the rhinos got pushed out. They had a cultural change within the Republican Party. It's a different party now. Really, if you look at it. The Democratic Party is also fracturing, but they don't seem to want to admit it. You have the socialist crowd that are more, into the, socialist movements that don't have the main support of the, full party, which is why the Trump administration is trying to position its talking points on saying, they've shifted far left and don't support them. You also have the Nancy Pelosi types who are more like the, institution Democrats, and then you have the classical liberal Democrats who are almost more libertarian in their thinking, like Jon Stewart. Jon Stewart, I would say, was more of a classical liberal. He was a Democrat, but he was more like classical liberal type. You have these three different groups within the Democratic Party, and they're clashing with each other. And so you have a fracturing within them as well that they're trying to deal with. I think Pelosi's trying to hold that all together. I don't want to go too deep into U.S. politics. When it comes into, although actually I do want to start trying to get some political debate on this channel. I might be inviting some conservatives and liberals and trying to just have them discuss politics. We'll see if I can do that in a harmonious way. I'm going to make an effort to. I think coming up with 2020, that's needed. Having actual discussion and debate, where I'm not trying to side with anyone. When it comes to Democrat position on China, we'll have to see. When it comes to Biden and Kamala Harris, I don't think they would be as tough on China. I think they would believe that you could negotiate with them and you could work with them. In fact, they've signaled that. And I don't know, based on what I've seen, that hasn't worked with China in the past. And we've seen Republicans experience that. We've seen Democrats experience that. I mean, Nixon, Bush, they weren't any better than really Clinton or Obama when it comes down to it. When it came to dealing with China, they all made bad decisions, at least in my analysis, when it came to China. And so they would probably continue that same thing unless things get pushed enough where they have no choice but to continue that, which it does seem that the popular backlash against the CCP right now is heading in that direction. And especially if human rights abuses and environmental destruction in China continue to get exposed, because then the Democrat voting base would see that. And really, a lot of these institutional politicians, they tend to move with public opinion when it comes to these things. So we'll have to see. From Maui's side, really appreciate it again. Thank you. I believe China will fall and break into 6 nations. What do you think? Actually, to be honest, I think that is one of the most likely situations we're going to see. I think currently the most likely situation we're going to see with China is a balkanization. And we're already seeing hints of it, because we're seeing provincial level governments fighting back against, or disobeying, I should say, top level governments. We're already seeing breaks within the party when it comes to provincial governments. It could also be something that breaking along the lines of the military theaters. We'll have to see. Now, one of the big issues you're going to have with China is the CCP is basically dying, or at least its hold on the whole country is dying. If it were to break into, say, 6 different countries, I mean, really, they could still keep the CCP going to an extent. It would be different. Each one would be a different interpretation of it. They could do it. When it comes to the rest of the world, we're gonna see some complicated issues, I think, with China, because what happened with Russia when the Soviet Union collapsed? Here's what happened: the Soviet Union collapsed, and who had money? Who were the people who had all the money in the country? It was the politicians and the Communist Party members. And what happened? As soon as it collapsed, the people with the money became a free, quote unquote, democratic society. The people who had the money bought up all the real estate, all the natural resources, and anything of value. And so you had basically the former Communist Party leaders become the free, open society, party leaders, essentially. And then the entire KGB and, all these criminal organizations, they went into the mafia. They became the Russian mafia. And so you had all the corrupt politicians still stay in power just through business, real estate, natural resources, and again through politics because they had all the money. And then you had all the, corrupt individuals who were carrying out abuses in these slave camps and gulags and so on, who had no problem hurting other people, who had no problem killing people, torturing people, whatever. And what happens? They become the mafia because they have no problem torturing people, killing people, or robbing people. I mean, and so I would hope that China learns from that somehow. How do you transition a country like that into a free society without having that happen? I don't have the answer for that, to be honest, and unless you had some kind of like grassroots, like moral or cultural reawakening of some kind. And how do you build something like that into policy? I don't know how to do it. You could look kind of at Taiwan and Chiang Kai-shek. He did something similar to that, where they had a decommunization system where they did teach traditional culture, China's traditional culture. People called him a fascist for it. But that was a system that helped get rid of the influence of the communist system. Now, that is different still from dealing with these corrupt politicians and individuals. It could be something like the fall of the Nazi regime, where all the people responsible stood trial. The communist countries never went through anything like that. Sorry, sometimes I have a map on my wall. Sometimes I look at it when I talk about countries. Yeah, well, and maybe that could work. Now that I think about it, you would need something similar to the denazification when it comes to communism, and all these individuals would need to be held accountable for their abuses of their people, for the theft, for all the crimes they committed, and you would need to basically make the communist system on par with the Nazis in terms of how things changed after that. And really, when it comes to the abuses of the CCP, that wouldn't be hard to do. It would just need the Chinese people, at the very least, to get behind that, which they probably would, to be honest. And so we'll have to see. Again, back to your question, though. Yeah, I actually do see in the short term a balkanization of China. I do think that is going to be the initial change we start seeing as the CCP breaks down. I do think there's going to be a total breakdown of it eventually, but I think the initial stage will be a balkanization, just in my personal analysis, of course. Nicole S. Other than sharing, appreciate it. Geez, thank you. I really appreciate, all of you donated again, really appreciate it. And everyone here, of course, really appreciate your support as well. It really means a lot to, me and the whole team. But Nicole S., other than sharing your channel, what else could a regular citizen do to help and keep CCP accountable? Honestly, just public knowledge has a lot of power to it. I mean, make noise online, repost articles online. China, when it comes to the CCP, it's actually interesting because it's not really a partisan issue. Some issues kind of are, if you talk about Trump policy on China, but if you talk about environmental destruction, if you talk about human rights abuses, if you talk about corrupt politics and disasters and all these other issues, really it's a bipartisan issue. And you have a lot of countries, India, Japan, Australia, it's a little more partisan in Australia, actually, but a lot of countries, it's not a partisan issue. In fact, India flipping to oppose the CCP, I've been saying, is actually really significant because India opposing the CCP and creating a model through which to do that for other Asian countries and African countries and so on. It can give a model on how to break from the CCP to countries within similar economic situations as them, which is a lot of those countries, and also possibly even become a regional leader. It has the position to do it. This is one of the reasons why China fears and hates India so much, and why it tries to use Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and other countries to basically box it in. Is because they see it as a strategic threat. They see the possible rise of India as being the threat to the possible rise of China economically. India doesn't have the drive. They don't care about world dominance, or these, at least as far as I can see, my analysis. I don't think they care about that. But they could play a very strong cultural influence when it comes to other countries. Point in all of this is China's not really a partisan issue. And so it is easy to talk about. And really, when it comes to challenging the CCP, their biggest weak point is ideology. Their biggest weak point is public knowledge. And so if you can make people aware of what they're doing, and really, I mean, you want to talk to like the left, for example, talk about all these corrupt, mega corporations that are knee deep in Chinese corruption. There's tons of them. If they don't like big business, what about all the big businesses involved in slave labor in Xinjiang using Muslim Uyghurs? That hits on just about every social issue you could possibly bring up, and the CCP is doing it as we speak. And these big companies are involved in it, a lot of them. Whether it's big business corruption, government corruption, I mean, again, it's not a partisan issue. I'd say expose it. That is the biggest weak point they have. Let's see here. Norman Bernard. Could Western Australia be a military danger from China and or North Korea? Bumper grain harvest coming. It could be. I don't think they will be. Basically because China right now is not in a state where it could do anything externally aggressive, at least in my analysis. And because Australia now is part of the Quad Alliance with the United States, Japan, and India, it would be a death sentence for the CCP. If you're in Australia, there was actually a book several years back you might find interesting. It was called The Kingdom and the Quarry. Actually, I read it. And it contained alleged leaked documents, I believe, from, I want to say, Australian intelligence that talked about alleged CCP plans for a surprise attack and invasion, including against Australia and the United States. It was interesting to watch that shortly after that book came out, the Obama administration actually restarted the U.S. Marine base in Australia, which from the defense analyst standpoint, among that community, did seem to be in response to those rumors. Whether that was the case, who knows? He also started the shift of the U.S. Navy to the Pacific. Right, there was that big Pacific shift of the U.S. Navy, and which was in relation to that. That did seem to be related. That there was intelligence saying the CCP was planning surprise attacks. I've interviewed people in the past, military intelligence guys, they, for articles, of course. They told me that basically what China was doing was trying to strong arm Australia. And they said it was like a mafia tactic. They went into Australia and they were like this. They were like, nice country you have. Be a shame if something happened to it. You should really side with us because we can protect you. So it's like, imagine a mobster going into a business and being like, oh, nice restaurant you have here. Be a shame if someone burned it down. I hope you have fire insurance. Luckily, we provide preventative measures like this if you pay us some money. It's a way of threatening them. The line the CCP was using basically was saying, you're too far away from the United States. They can't come and save you. We could destroy you before they got here. You might as well align with us because we can give you all this other stuff and you'll be safe and we won't have to worry about a conflict. That's what they did to Australia. And after they got in there, of course, they developed political ties, subverted the universities, it's actually interesting. Not really the media as much, maybe the state media more so, but there's actually some of the media coverage there in Australia has been pretty strong, exposing these CCP forms of subversion. And so it's interesting there. But again, no, I don't think Australia's under military threat from China right now, given the Quad Alliance and given the current state of the CCP. It would be a death sentence for the CCP if it were to do that. I guarantee you, not only would the entire Quad Alliance join in, but so would most of Europe. And I don't think Russia would get involved in that. It's like imagine you're at a bar and your drunk buddy starts a fight with like 50 people, and you're like, and he's like, hey, jump in and save me, bro. Sometimes you need to let someone learn their lesson. I don't think Russia would support the CCP in that one, especially if it's India, because Russia and India are pretty close as well. Dana G. Nielsen, appreciate the donation. Thank you. Awesome reporting, Josh. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Remind people of your Patreon. All right. Yes, we do have a Patreon. Well, really appreciate you all donating here. It means a lot. Again, if you want to really support this channel, also go to Patreon. We do have a team on Patreon. We do have a group on Patreon, and so really, again, appreciate your support there. If you do want to support us, it's getting late, so I'll do a few more. From Mineral Tim 79, do you think South Korea took some money from China? I think it's possible. Oh, wow. Denise Cooper, really appreciate it. Geez, I'll get to your question in a minute. Let me finish this question, though. Mineral Tim, 79. Do you think South Korea took some money from China? It's speculation. I don't want to make accusations I can't back up. I will say that China would regard South Korea as being extremely strategically important. And I would say, leading up to where things are at now, was at the very least, say, suppressing a lot of countries, including South Korea, mainly through fear. Would the U.S. come to their rescue, at least before Trump? I don't know. Maybe they wouldn't have. And at the same time, could they engage with China on business, for example, selling their high-tech chips? Yes, they could, and they were. Um, Politics in South Korea are really complicated. I've done several stories about some of the craziness of the South Korean political system. If you look at their political history, it's like Game of Thrones. Like, people, alleged assassinations, former politicians getting put in prison by current politicians. It's wild. And it's funny because they're very proper people. Their politics are wild. I mean, it's wild in the U.S. too, but they're serious there. It's interesting watching South Korean politics. I like South Koreans. I get along with them. Their politics are pretty wild. But when it comes to China and South Korea, they do have close ties, and we saw this a bit during we did see this a bit during the virus outbreak, where the president there did seem to side with the CCP pretty strongly, including keeping borders open, including bringing in Chinese to fight racism and these types of things. At the same time, South Korea dealt with the virus pretty well, it did seem. So, it's complicated. But yeah, they do have a lot of ties. I wouldn't make accusations saying that they take money from them, because I couldn't prove it. Denise Coop, I really appreciate the ongoing support. It really means a lot to us. Question though, he said he spoke earlier in the week about China being involved in some of the riots. Vans have been seen handing out shields and weapons. How involved do you think China is, and do you think they are involved in protesters getting weapons on the streets? Hard to say with them getting weapons on the streets. If the CCP were to give out weapons, very likely they'd go directly to the organizations pulling the strings. They would probably go through the tongs. The tongs would sell to like gangs, and the gangs would hand it out. Normally they would go through back channels like that. The tongs, like the Chinese fraternal organizations, the tongs run the triads. The tongs control the Chinatowns. Triads control the criminal markets. Actually, it's been interesting. In the past few years, I've talked to sheriffs and police. They say that the tongs or the triads are getting involved in the drug trade real heavy. It used to be the case that they controlled the ports, and the Chinese mafia controls the ports. From there was a handoff to the drug cartels or to the local gangs, and the gangs committed the main crimes on U.S. soil. The triads, Chinese mafia, would mainly supply the ingredients. They do human trafficking type stuff, but there'd be a handoff. Now you see the triads getting directly involved in organized crime in the United States. Or, a lot of the grow houses, for example, with some drugs are being done by them. And this is a trend on the uptick, at least from what I've been hearing from some sources I have within, law enforcement. On the note of you saying China getting involved in feeding the riots, there was a report on that. It was Radio Free Asia. Although I think it was only their Chinese edition that had it. I'm actually kind of shocked that there hasn't been more reporting on it. There's a website called Chinascope, CHINASCOPE, that does translation of a lot of these, articles and so on. They had it on there, and I saw it, and I went to the original link, and sure enough, it was there. RFA had a report on it. And what the CCP was doing was this. They had members of the 2PLA going to the Houston consulate. I'm sorry if you're hearing background noise. I'm in New York again. It's an apartment. So they had members of the Chinese military from the 2PLA. I'll explain what this means. They had members from the 2PLA going to the Chinese consulate in Houston. And from there, they were going and using some big data program, analyzing data and sending training videos on how to organize riots to people who they identified using big data as having interest in Black Lives Matter and Antifa. So yeah, they were involved with this, which is wild. And it could actually be a sign of why the Chinese consulate in Houston was closed down by the U.S. Wild stuff. Now, what is the 2PLA? So you all might remember when the Obama administration indicted those Chinese hackers, right? The military hackers. Those guys were with the General Staff Department, 3rd Department. That was Unit 61398. And that, everyone called it China's hacker army. The General Staff Department is the war-fighting branch of the Chinese military, right? So this was a war-fighting act. Now, under the war-fighting department, the General Staff Department, you have a few different branches. You have the 3rd Department, 2nd Department, and 4th Department, and others as well. 2nd Department is the human intelligence branch. So like traditional spies, military spies. The ones sent to the consulate were 2 PLA, Chinese spies. 3 PLA with like the hacker army, that would be signals intelligence. 4th Department, electronics intelligence. The military hackers who were indicted by the Trump administration a few months back were 4 PLA. That was the 54 Research Institute. Those were the guys accused of hacking Equifax, which had all the private data on Americans. And so again, what is the war-fighting branch of the Chinese military doing, sending human spies to its consulates to send out, training videos on how to start riots on American soil, targeting groups who might be involved in what really were race riots in some parts of the country? Why would the war-fighting branch of the Chinese military be doing something like that? I mean, this is something important to consider. This is on par with the Trump Russia scandal they tried making. In terms of significance, this is on par with that. And to be honest, I'm shocked that this wasn't widely reported. Again, RFA had it. Chinascope had a brief translation of it. You can find it. It's getting late. I'll just do a couple more questions. No, RM, really appreciate the support. Thank you. And New York, again, appreciate the support as well. Josh, you are amazing. Never forget that. Appreciate it. Thank you. Also, why is the U.S. testing so aggressively? Is there something strategic at play here? Well, the U.S. is, when it comes to testing for the virus, the U.S. is just acting how a country would normally act in the case of an alleged pandemic. One of the things the Trump administration says is that the numbers are higher because we're testing people and we're actually reporting our numbers. A lot of countries are not testing or reporting. And so, this is the wildest pandemic, I think, in history. And we haven't had that many, I guess, that most of us can remember. But in terms of an international lockdown like this, essentially, and as a journalist, it's everyone has their own experience of it. For a journalist, this whole thing has been wild because you hear reports saying everything under the sun, and a lot of them contradict each other. Some of them claim to be scientific based, and if you question any of them, they're threatening to like pull your videos offline and like censor you. It's wild. It's the craziest situation. When it comes to politics, unfortunately, the virus has been politicized. There are groups using it for political purposes. I do think the virus is real. I do think in China it's really serious, actually. I don't think it hit as hard in some countries as was anticipated. And I do think a lot of countries, despite that, have used it, strategically for their own personal gain. I do think that is the unfortunate situation of it. And personally, I do think we are going to see, I do believe, a second wave. I really think we're going to see it, given what's happening in China right now. And it's something I'm concerned about, to be honest. And so I think the U.S. is acting responsibly at this time. But at the same time, I know it's complicated because there's a lot of government corruption. Let's just be honest, right? And there are a lot of groups trying to use this for their own gain, unfortunately. All right, I'll do one more question because it's getting late. Let's see here. From Jaime Pounce Leon E. Rodrigo. I'll do two more. I got two more, then I'll end it here. I have a question. I come from Bolivia and Latin America, and Chinese have emptied the pharmacies as early as February. Any news from Bolivia in particular concerning China? Unfortunately, the Chinese Communist Party has gotten a lot of support throughout Latin America. In Latin America, you have, going back to the Soviet Union, alliances between the Soviets, Cuba, and through those alliances, starting up different armed insurrections across Latin America. A lot of the narco-terror groups were through that. And also you had China, Russia, and Cuba get involved in the drug trade and create criminal networks and corruption throughout the entire region. And so it's been subverted for a long time, unfortunately. And as things currently stand, you have the Foro ao Sao Paulo, it's like an annual meeting of far left governments, and they were the ones who started the Pink Revolution, where socialist governments swept across most of Latin America. Mexico has been communist basically since like, geez, the 1930s, before 1913 or something. Not like Soviet level, but communist policies. They had policies, for example, like they seized all the land from the landowners and they redistributed to the peasants. It was complicated because the Catholic Church told them not to take the money, because at the time you could be excommunicated if you were a communist. Some people took the land failed. Some people didn't take it. They became poor and they fled to the United States, where you had mass immigration to the US. The issues in Latin America are very complicated. A lot of it does come from Soviet and Cuban subversion policies, later Chinese subversion policies, Maoist movements there. And now then for Sao Paulo, Pink Revolution, and countries now being subverted through the CCP again with the One Belt, One Road initiative. The CCP has huge influence there, as does Iran and as does Russia. When it comes to the CCP buying up medicine from pharmacies as early as February, yeah, they were doing that all over the place. They knew there were issues with this virus. They were trying to corner the market when it came to medicine, medical supplies, and so yeah, they were doing that in many countries. All right, last question tonight. Otherwise, I can go all night. Real quick. Will Work, really appreciate it, your support. NKSB, also really appreciate it, and Maria L. Perez, thank you as well. I don't want. I'll go all night if I keep taking questions, so I'll just do this last one. Oh wow, and Keaton Simmons, thank you as well. Last question from Othium. I might be saying that wrong. You have to forgive me. If China were to break down into several countries, what would those new countries' boundaries be roughly? Thanks. Love the show. Hard to say, to be honest. It could split along provincial lines. This is how I see it. It's either going to split along provincial lines or it's going to split along the military control lines, at least as far as I can see it. Because you have regional militaries in China. It's possible the regional militaries will just become regional powers. For example, if it was a military coup, maybe you would have regional powers established by the military. That is a possibility. If it were a government level break and coup, then you would have provincial level governments doing it. And so I think it would depend on which group seizes power, the military or the government or the provincial government. And so, yeah, you could have a break along provincial lines or a break along military control lines. I think those are the two possibilities I would say, just based on my own analysis. Not for sure. That's just my analysis. All right. Last of all, Vicious Victor T, thank you as well. And you said I've cornered the market on bourbon blatants. Good for you. All right, everyone. It's late. I don't want to go too long. All right. But again, really appreciate you all. You're awesome. I love reading your comments. It's all of you who make this show possible. And so thank you all, genuinely. From the whole team here. And Nate, we had 400,000 subscribers. It's incredible. It's only been like a bit over a year, I think. I never saw this coming. And so, really, it's everyone here who's made this happen. So really, genuinely, thank you. All right, that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free. Thank you.